Many people feel that the government schools are not effective, and so you see this mass exit to private schools. On the other hand, the private schools are only available to those who can pay the fees, and so you really worry about what that means for economic stratification of our education system. The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and civil society has a scale deficit, right? India is the most over-centralized country in the world, as I show in the book. One of the concerns with lateral entry is the professionals worry that does this become a way to kind of, bring in favors, bring in political influence, bring in other concerns.
Welcome, Professor Karthik, to Rishihood. Long time we were wanting to have you on campus, and it's been great interacting you since morning. How was your experience been so far?
No, it's been wonderful. I think, every time it's just great to interact with students and with faculty, and it's been wonderful.
So at Rishihood University, we have the Rashtram School of Public Leadership. It's a very interesting institutional structure that it's like a think tank embedded within a university because of our focus on public policy and public impact. So we want Rashtram to be the engine of driving a lot of thought. And your book comes as a welcome thing for us because a lot of our ideas that we had for a long time have found validation in your book. And you have given very good evidence that why intuitively what we were thinking is right. So I have put down a manifesto called the Rashtram Manifesto. There are about 8 manifesto points written here. And these are some broad ideas on which we want to keep working in the days to come. This could mean in terms of white papers. It could also go all the way up to PhD topics to give these ideas a theoretical foundation. And at the same time, we also want to produce some pilot projects. So some of the ideas listed here would help us. I mean, it's just anchoring us to what areas that we are going to focus on. So you have the manifesto with you. I would want to know what are your broad comments when you see a manifesto like this, because you have also talked about it in your book as well.
No, this is fantastic, and I think first of all I commend you for putting something like this together, because see, I think in terms of catalyzing action, it usually helps to have certain sharp areas where you say this is what we want to do and why. Okay, so looking at the points you mentioned, many of these are very consistent with what I've talked about in the book, and in many ways I think this is exactly the kind of output, that the kind of downstream impact that I hope my book would have, right? Because the point is to catalyze thousands of change makers for the country with a set of ideas that then they can take to their communities, take to their governments, take, and take it forward in different ways. So I'm delighted to see this. And specifically in terms of some of the ideas you're talking about, so introducing public charter schools, okay? I think this is absolutely something that we need to try more of. And see, the debate of public versus private schools in India is highly polarized, right? Because at one level, many people feel that the government schools are not effective, and so you see this mass exit to private schools. On the other hand, the private schools are only available to those who can pay the fees, and so you really worry about what that means for economic stratification of our education system. So the idea of a public charter school, and of course, for your listeners who may not know this, but which is what you have, is very simple, right? Name that it is, you have public schools. They're still public schools because you don't charge fees and you don't do selective admissions. So anybody who applies can get in, and if there's limited places, then you have a lottery to see who gets in. But you can give the management contract, like to a motivated private kind of non-profit operator who is then able to manage kind of whether it's accountability, whether it's aspects of curriculum and content, and then they're paid on a per student basis. So the right place to start this would be in some of our urban areas that you have municipal schools in prime real estate, often with like 20% enrollment. So it's a massive underutilization of prime land. So if you were to start with some of those places and saying and of course the key is to find high quality operators, because the problem is there's a lot of private education operators are also essentially profiteering, like entities that are not necessarily committed to education. Okay, but there are several high quality providers, right? People, Akanksha, these are orgs that I know that run high quality schools, but right now they're funded by CSR, and that limits the scale. So like Manish Sabarwal has famously said, which I say in chapter 9 of the book, the government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and civil society has a scale deficit, right? So if you want to bring the efficiency of private management and the good-heartedness of civil society into scale, you then need to find ways to integrate that with government. So that's, for example, an excellent idea that deserves to be fleshed out, piloted. And again, these are never things that should be rolled out across a whole state overnight. but it is to bring new thinking into government. And it is not enough to think. You have to think and then demonstrate that it can be done, and then you document, and then you see, can it be done at a larger scale? So I'm a huge fan of this kind of idea, and I think all of the ideas here are sensible, and I talked about that because that's where I've done the most research. But increasing local government funding, absolutely. Like, it's critical for the health of our democracy that we decentralize more. India is the most over-centralized country in the world, as I show in the book. And most service delivery issues need to be solved at the local government level. A prime minister, a chief minister cannot be monitoring whether a teacher or doctor is attending a particular clinic. And then in the end, that is a community, the community is the ultimate stakeholder, right? So you need more of the local control. I think ideas like ranked choice voting, I'm delighted you picked up on this, because, see, democracy is sacrosanct. I think it has been key to Indian kind of, our political stability comes from the legitimacy that our democracy provides to whoever is in power, okay? But the rules of the game matter a lot for the kind of incentives that are created by democracy, right? So what happens in the first past the post is that there is a much stronger political incentive to cultivate a devoted base rather than governing from the center in a way that benefits everybody. And what ranked choice voting does is it's still complete democracy, then that is sacrosanct, but it actually has a lot of good properties which multiple Nobel Prize winners have recommended. So I'm really happy you picked up on that and seeing if one could do. And the interesting thing is, constitutionally, there's no barrier to RCV at all, because we use ranked choice voting for our presidential elections. We use it for many MLC elections. So there's nothing. And now with EVMs, it's even the only concern about it is, can people rank their votes? And in an EVM, you can say first, second, third. You can tabulate it. So if you're able to build enough momentum to run some pilots for this in local government elections, that would be an incredible national service.
Thank you, Professor Karthik, for sharing that. I mean, I agree that a lot of these points have been elaborated in the book as well. So I recommend our audience to read the book as well. Two of these points I felt I have pushed a bit further than what you have mentioned in the book. One is on the civil services. You talk about performance management, you talk about increasing accountability, giving them incentives for performance, but you have not gone to the extent of saying about lateral entries and lateral exits as much, right? Something like possibly the Agniveer scheme for civil servants, that every few years few of them exit and few of them enter based on their performance. So why would you have stopped before that? I mean, is there a reason that you feel that should be extended further?
No. So I think I'm glad that you start with that, because in many ways that is, I think, the core of state capacity, right? So I completely agree, right? And I don't disagree. It's just that I don't use the term entry or exit, partly because, see, it's important to first remember, start from what is the problem we are solving for. Okay? So we are solving first for numbers because we don't have enough civil servants, and then you're solving for keeping your skills current, and you're solving for the incentives to perform. Okay. So in a way, what I have recommended is exactly for this, right? That you have a certain number of permanent civil servants, but the problem is, in any effective organization, you need a pyramid. Okay. Whereas in the IAS, we built a cylinder, right? I mean, so once you enter, you are almost guaranteed by seniority to kind of reach a certain level regardless of performance, okay? So the question is, like, but whereas in the military or most other organizations, there is kind of an up or out, right? Like, I mean, at different parts. So, but as a practical way of implementing this, what I have recommended, which is actually very close, I've just gone into the details and not used that exact term. So I think I say it as much. And what I've said is that every year, right, the UPSC is one of the most intense exams. We put a lot of effort in that, but we select only the top 0.1%. And which means and the average candidate attempts this 2 or 3 times. So which means for every one candidate you select, the cost is over 2,000 man years of time of student, studying for the exam. So what I propose is, you can take the top 1%, okay? And so you still keep your top 0.1% who are selected, but you take the next 0.9% and you empanel them, okay? And you empanel them and saying, because you have come through this objective process. See, one of the concerns with lateral entry is the professionals worry that does this become a way to kind of, bring in favors, bring in political influence, bring in other concerns. And the moment you have that can compromise the civil service, right? So to do lateral entry, you first need to build a process that is like Caesar's wife, right? I mean, so it is legitimate and everybody accepts that this is held to the same standard, okay? So we already have the UPSC. So why reinvent the wheel? So from that 0.1, you empanel the next 1%. Now, but the beauty of this is the empanelment makes you eligible for a job, but it doesn't guarantee you a job, okay? But then any state government, any central government, any PSU, anybody who wants talent can then they can have their own additional criteria, but then they can recruit on 3 to 5 year contracts from that pool. So then with 5 year contracts, the problem is if you do short-term 1 year contract, then people are not invested in the government. If you give a lifetime contract, then you lose the incentives for accountability. So I think 5 years is just about 3 to 5 years is about the right duration that you have enough stability to learn your job and do it well, but enough accountability that you will continue doing it better. Okay. And that has many advantages, right? So today in the tax department, you get selected by exam, but there is no preference given to people with CA or law or economics or the relevant disciplines, right? In the forest department, you want people with botany and zoology. And we have no way of even matching any sense of your subject knowledge with the job. And now what happens is because the empaneled pool is reasonably large, in that pool, you can say you have come through a professional process, but now I can match you better based on your kind of qualifications and interests. So I'm very much in line. Now, I think the exit part, I have not emphasized that just to make sure because that can get politicized, but I think by saying 5 year contracts that are renewed on performance, de facto it is exit for those who are not performing, right? So
thank you. The beauty of the book as well is the way you have just explained now. You have thought through not just, what are the second order effects, the third order effects of it, and you have come up with very practical solutions for this. The last point the very interesting points mentioned here, but one other thought which I found very unique in your book, which I have not seen elsewhere, is delimitation, the challenges that are going to come in terms of the geographical representation. You have tried to balance it by saying equal representation in the upper house, that's the Rajya Sabha, which also is like the US Senate. And I also got educated in the US, so that was an amazing model that I saw there, and I thought about this always, but I found this in the book as well. So just if you could elaborate further on it, because it's very little in the book about it, but why do you think this is a great idea about having an equal representation in the Rajya Sabha?
yeah, so I think, and so to be fair, I'm not saying that that is the only way out, right? What I'm highlighting is that, see, in the federalism chapter, the federalism and decentralization, I think I'm first starting with the first principles of how do you architect government to best deliver for citizens, right? And so the first principles of federalism are that the functions that require scale and coordination should sit with the center. Functions that require accommodation of regional diversity should sit with the state. And functions that require responding to local information should sit with local government, right? Now, the thing is, India is one of the most over-centralized countries in the world. Now, and there are complex political, economic, and social reasons which I discuss. But one of our great political challenges that's going to come up is delimitation, right? Which is till 71, we redid the parliamentary constituencies based on population, and then we froze that partly because Indira Gandhi wanted to support population control. And then in 2001, that was renewed for another 25 years. And the reason this is politically going to be incredibly challenging is that the population growth has been so different over the past 40, 50 years that doing a complete population-based delimitation in the Lok Sabha is going to dramatically kind of negatively affect certain states who have done well both in terms of economic growth and in terms of not just, I don't want to make population control a virtue. I think what they have done is improve girls' education because girls' education is actually the best source of that. So long story short, it is a wicked problem. And the reason it's a wicked problem is because we have two principles that are equally valid that are going to conflict with each other. There is equal representation for every citizen principle. But in the federal principle, you also give each state an equal voice. Okay, and so there is a very well established precedent in other complex, large federal structures like the US and Europe, where you have one house of parliament or one house that represents equal per person, and then you have another that has equal per state, which is what the Senate does. Now, I'm not 100% sure, okay, that necessarily is the right solution for India. But what I've suggested is there are 3 or 4 approaches, right, that we can take, okay. One is exactly like you mentioned, that maybe the Rajya Sabha is where we bring the equality of the states, okay, and that's one way to balance if you're going to delimit in the Lok Sabha by population. The other thing I've suggested is maybe, we say that we keep the parliamentary representation the way it is because it's worked fine and there was a certain implicit contract that was made. And so it would be a violation of that contract to kind of tell the states that have done well on demographics that now you're going to be penalized. But we may say that we will start doing fiscal transfers a little bit more based on population. But I think the last, which I think really needs to be on the table, is really revisiting the 7th schedule of the Constitution and thinking about what does the concurrent list actually mean. Okay, so the logic of the concurrent list is that when you take a topic that has See, what is the hardest thing in federalism is that when a well-designed federalism will work well by putting functions at different levels. But if you have disagreement about how to function, then that same piece of land sits in a city government, in a state government, in a national government. So who has the say? And in India, we have interpreted the concurrent list as to say that the center always has the say if there is a conflict. Okay?
Yeah.
But I think there is a case for reimagining a concurrent list because effectively that means you have made the concurrent list de facto a central list, because if the center disagrees, it is de facto center, right? But I think one way to make that seventh schedule and concurrent list have more meaning is to say that in the topic, even if it's in the concurrent list, if the domain is within state boundaries, then the state has precedence. It is only if it crosses state boundaries that it becomes a central government issue. And there is in fact a Supreme Court judgment by Justice Nariman, which I talk about, in the case of the cooperative legislation, where I think he's following exactly this principle. The court is following this principle that says, because Government of India tried to bring in legislation to regulate cooperatives, which was in the state in the states list or in the concurrent list, and it was interpreted as saying that Government of India can regulate multi-state cooperatives, but single state cooperative that is within a state should be within the jurisdiction of the state, right? So I think one other way to balance this is to say that if you're going to do delimitation, that sharply increases the power, the representation, but then that should not dramatically affect the lives of citizens in other states. Yeah. So that means you have to rethink, and that's why I call delimitation both a challenge and an opportunity. It is a challenge because it really requires, in my view, and I feel we haven't done enough thoughtful public conversation on this. It requires like a truly non-partisan commission, almost like a mini constituent assembly, because you are re-architecting the federal contract, right, the mean of India, the federal compact. But as part of that, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us to get the decentralization story right. So I think it requires serious thought, but I'm glad, I'm glad you're thinking about it.
Thank you for, a lovely conversation. We can keep talking about it whole day, and each of these points is so fascinating that I would want to pick your brains more, but we'll close it for now, and I'm sure that we'll have our interactions going forward and build on some of these ideas here.
My pleasure. And yeah, it's been an absolute joy to come and spend time here, and congratulations on everything you're trying to do here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.